Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
We're going to be looking at the biblical basis for creation care today, and following on from Dave's presentation last week, we're going to begin by looking up. I'm going to ask Darren to read for us from Psalm 8, verses 3 to 9. So over to you, Darren.
So namely miss being God's bright and with Eden doing light. You put us in charge of your handcraft world, repeated as your Genesis charge, made us leads of sheep and cattle, even when animals out of the world, birds flying and fish swimming, washes sitting in the ocean deeps. God, brilliant Lord, your name echoes around the world. Is that it?
That's it. Yeah, thank you, Darren.
Right, okay.
That's an interesting version you got there.
Yes. Yes. It's the truth version.
Excellent. So I think the whole so last night Charles, my son-in-law, was with us this weekend, and he and Liz went out and looked up at the night sky because it was a lovely clear evening. You've got some pictures there of that Roger's found with some of the galaxies on there, and we can look up to see the glory of God's created order. And we have been given the privilege of being put in charge of God's created order. So I thought I'd start by giving something of my own story in terms of care for creation. I've been a member of the RSPB since I was 7, so that's quite a number of years. I'll let you do the calculation on that one. I've always been fascinated with birds and the variety of species and their behaviour, and how at certain times there is codependency upon humans. I remember feeding stations when the ground was frosty, you get far more birds coming, and natural places for food are scarce. But as you study one particular aspect of creation, it's amazing how each separate species is adapted to live in a particular environment. And then there's also the beauty of a single feather, the complexity of its structure, how certain birds flock together for protection. And one of the lovely aspects of watching birds down here are the murmurations of starlings that we see in Brighton on winter evenings. Linked into that, one of the influences on my Christian life has been John Stott, one of the clearest preachers I've ever heard, with his Bible teaching and his clarity of thought and his application of biblical principles. But John was also a keen bird watcher, and he wrote a book called Birds Are Teachers, Biblical Lessons from a Lifelong Bird Watcher, which I have in my collection. So what I've noticed over the last 50 years is a massive reduction in this country of species and an increasing rarity of certain birds. And there's one example of that I think you might know, which is the cuckoo, a call that signaled the beginning of spring when this bird arrived. But when was the last time any of you heard a cuckoo call?
Do you want answers to that?
Yes, please.
Well, actually, 2 years ago, we went for a walk in the Bluebell Woods at, not Arlington, is it Arlington?
Yes.
Where it's not far away, and the cuckoo was cuckooing all the time.
Excellent.
Yes.
But prior to that, we hadn't heard it for, must be 10 years, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right, Patrick. So, that used to be quite a common call that was heard in April, May time, and now most of them, if they reach here, they go north. So Scotland, north of England, very few in this area at all. The other reflection that I've got in my lifetime is that we've seen a major reduction in another form of wildlife, which is insect life. Do you remember driving in your car?
Yes.
And the windscreen being covered in small squashed insects?
Yeah.
You hardly notice that now in the summer. So we each will be able to recognize there have been significant changes in our lifetimes. And as Dave's talk reminded us last week, those changes are set to accelerate again in our lifetimes, but certainly during the lives of our children and our grandchildren.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, there are Christians who ask the question, why should we care for creation? Can't we just exercise dominion by extracting all that we can from the earth, use as many of the resources as we can, and then wait for Jesus to return, at which point God will restore the earth? What I want to do this afternoon is look at what I believe is the biblical basis on which we can look at how caring for creation is a key responsibility for followers of Jesus. So I'm going to start by looking at, firstly, at how God cares about creation. And we're going to begin at the very beginning, which is a very good place to start. But I don't want you all to break into song at this point.
What a glorious film that was.
Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God cares about creation because he chose to create it of his own free will and for his own purposes. The entire natural order is and remains God's possession.
Yeah.
But interestingly, when we look at the Gospel of John and the beginning of John's Gospel, John chapter 1, verse 3, we'll see that someone else was involved with creation. In the beginning was the Word. The Word is the John's description of Jesus. And he was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him. And without him was not anything made that was made. So through Jesus, all things were made. And when you read back in Genesis 1, the creation account, what's the picture of God that we have? A hardworking and conscientious laborer who has satisfaction at a job well done. God saw that it was good. Then if we look in the Psalms, and one example of that is Psalm 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God. Creation reflects something of God's character and God's nature. So the created order is good and beautiful, independent of our presence in it. In Psalm 148, the psalmist says, the sun, moon, mountains and hills, the animals, birds and sea creatures all praise the Lord. God hasn't simply created the world and left it to run itself. God is still actively involved in sustaining creation. And he does that through Jesus. So in Hebrews 1, we see Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Then Paul writes to the church in Colossae, Colossians 1, for by him, Jesus, all things were created. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And the language in the book of Job and in the Psalms is of a God who is intimately involved in caring for creation. Psalm 65 says, you care for the land and water it, you enrich it abundantly. And then again into the Gospels, as Jesus shows the same concern for creation. One of the stories he tells of his Father's care for creation. He illustrates by saying, "Are not two sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from the will of your Father." And what Jesus is saying here is that God values even the lowliest of creatures. God cares about his creation. Then surely we, as part of the created order, should also care for the created world that God has given to us to be stewards over. My second heading is caring for creation is part of being human. God's creation is a dynamic and fruitful environment. It's not timeless and unchanging. Just as we seek as disciples of Jesus to become more like him, being transformed into his likeness, this idea of development is important as we think about our relationship to our environment. Words that are used by secular groups talk about preservation and conservation, but we can talk about redemption, restoration, improving existing environments. I'm involved in a small way in the group looking after the local green space in Princess Drive, which contains grass and trees and a small path up the side. And one option will be to keep it as it is. But what I've noticed just from walking there is that there's far more insects and therefore birds and probably mammals in the very tiny section on the left where there is a path and there are shrubs and small trees than there is in the rest of the green space. And so the idea of the group is to let some more of the grass grow in the green space, not to cut it down all the time, to encourage insects and plant some more trees to give cover to birds, and therefore to improve the existing environment. What we need to remember as human beings is that we've been created out of the same dust. Genesis 2 uses the same word to describe how animals, birds, and humans are formed from the ground. We share the same food as animals, but so we're not separate from creation. And that can be very easy to forget when we live in our centrally heated houses in a town and we only have fleeting interactions with animals and birds. But creation begins with Adam and Eve living in the Garden of Eden, enjoying the fruits of all the trees. Now we know that one tree, the knowledge of good and evil, was out of bounds, and the temptation to eat it was too much for Eve and Adam. So sin makes its appearance, disobedience to God's commands, rebellion against the Creator God. And as a result, living in the land became more dangerous. The joy of childbirth was marred by pain. Even production of food became painful toil. And so we begin to see the alienation of humanity from the land. And throughout the Old Testament, the link between human disobedience and the infertility of the land is made. We suffer when creation suffers. And this is where redemption is such an important concept. God doesn't leave us to the consequences of our sin. He comes in the person of Jesus to redeem us as individuals, to save us from the consequences of our sin. And I believe that when we take part in restoring creation by clearing the land and digging ponds and planting plants and trees, restoration brings new life to that part of the earth. So just as Jesus brings new life through his death on the cross. Although we are created from the same dust as animals and other creatures, there's something special about us. Human beings are uniquely made in God's image and are given a command by God to rule over and to take care of creation. So we're given responsibility by God to rule on his behalf. And that's God's rule, God's kingdom, which is characterized by love and compassion, not by dominating and exploiting. Genesis 2:15 says that God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the word translated work is abad, which carries the sense of to serve. And the word for take care is shamar, which means to keep to guard, to protect. So our dominion over creation is not exploitative and selfish, but one of careful and just service. One of the terms that's sometimes used to describe how humans care for creation is being good stewards, or stewardship. And that is helpful when we're called to manage existing resources well. But perhaps another image that might help us in thinking about how we are to exercise dominion over the earth is that of the shepherd or the servant king, the role given to the kings of Israel. And it's the role that's adopted by Jesus when he exercises authority in his ministry. The shepherd's rule is directed entirely to the benefit of God's whole kingdom. It's not about the king gaining material goods for themselves. Back to Colossians 1:15, when Paul talks about Jesus as the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the hallmark of what it means to be truly human. And as disciples of Jesus, we are called to work towards servant leadership over the whole of created order. So it's not a resource to be exploited, but a domain entrusted to our care and protection. Now, I thought at this point, it might be good to have a little break. And there's just a few of us here, so we'll probably can talk about this question. Maybe, Roger, if you could take the slide down at this point, that would be good. Thank you. Yeah, great. And the question I've got here is, how do we see our role in being stewards of creation, given that many of us are not directly involved in farming? So, any thoughts?
One of the ways is to have a careful mind as to how we use products that come from the natural world, the food we buy, the energy we use. In other words, to work as closely with the natural world rather than against it. Because, as you say, unless you're directly involved in food production, then you're on the demand side, aren't you? So
yeah.
What you demand of the system, it will produce for you because it wants the money. And if you demand things that demand exploitation, then that's what you'll get.
Yeah.
So that's one way, I think, that we could engage.
Mm.
Because all of us have to eat, don't we? All of us have to live, we have to move around. All of those things have an impact.
Mm.
One of the things, is it all right for me to speak?
Yeah, do. Yeah.
One of the things that happened last year was that I don't know who started it. It could have been the National Trust or RSPB, but there was a movement called No Mow May. And we didn't cut our grass at all, front or back, for the whole of May, which we think was a good thing to do because the invertebrates are breeding. We need the invertebrates to pollinate the fruit trees, the bushes. We need the invertebrates for pollination for a lot of the food that we need to harvest later on. So I would say that one of the things that we can do is to spread the word and encourage people not to be so tidy.
I mean, there are a number of initiatives, aren't there, in Seaford and around, which are all about that, and about letting the grass grow or sowing wild flowers or planting trees, all kinds of natural history stuff, and in a way that's a more accessible way of connecting yourself into this into stewardship. And actually, I think what I've noticed is that as you become involved in those kinds of things and start to understand that it engenders a kind of relationship or love for creation, which may not be there otherwise. Because as you say, Andy, it's very easy living in our centrally heated homes and mostly engaged in indoor work, I would say, a lot of us. We become very, very disconnected with the natural world. And so it becomes hard to love it and care for it in that way. But yeah, so that's another way.
You can get a metal daisy on a pole from the county council, stick on your grass verge, and then they will only cut the grass verge once in the year. Although they only cut it twice now, but I mean that's a move. And also there's clothing, of course.
Yeah.
What your clothing and what your shoes are going to be made of. When I worked in Brighton, we had a telephone number very close to another one, and we were always getting telephone calls. Is that the vegetarian shoe shop?
Really?
People buying non-leather shoes. Yeah.
I was going to mention caring for animals. I mean, one simple example would be, and I'm sure we all do it anyway, would be to buy free range eggs, you know, thinking about how the hens are treated. It's just an example. But, you know, caring for animals and also teaching your children and grandchildren to care for animals, I think can make a difference.
If you keep a compost heap going, then you're cutting down on any fertilizers you might be tempted to buy.
We did have a little problem. I remember in Oxford we had one of those compost bins, and then we had a problem with a rat, and the local pest control officer came around. He said, "The rats think this is a rat hotel." He said, feeding fresh food in at the top, and it's nice and warm at the bottom for them.
Yeah.
There are sometimes
no, but you can build ones that go into the ground, can't you? Like you put food in and it the way that
yes, that's right. But yeah. Anyway, sorry to.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
There does seem to be, leaving this, the point that Sheila made about care for animals, there does seem to be this fashion going about veganism, doesn't it? Where you have no animal products whatsoever. In other words, you don't engage animals in your life in any respect. Renewable, like eggs or milk or anything. I'm certainly not the meat of animals, as if that were somehow the right and moral thing to do. It's being sold as a moral issue rather than just a lifestyle issue, isn't it? How do you respond to that particular movement?
Well, I think the whole of creation has been given for us to use, isn't it? I mean I haven't looked into the sort of biblical verses about, you know, what would justify veganism or vegetarianism, but I don't see that as being something that happened. I mean, you know, obviously Jesus had fish as well as bread, didn't he? I mean, there's you know, the Passover meal is lamb. You know, I mean, there's so I think, you know, that there's not anything from within Scripture that would warrant it being a completely vegetarian. But I think there also is getting the balance right. For me, this whole stewardship thing. If you're cutting down large parts of the Amazon jungle so that you can have more cattle to supply, you know, a large international burger chain, shall we say, then that's getting it out of kilter with the whole balance of creation, really.
Yeah.
But Rachel, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right, Andy. That that the our appetite for meat is well over what we really healthily should eat, and as you say, yeah, livestock covers a huge proportion of the earth and means that yeah, Amazon rainforests are cut down, but it's not just Amazon rainforests, it's also you know, in this country too. But I mean, I can understand where the vegans come from, which is that they're saying, you know, if you exploit animals, if you industrialize them, then that's not really looking after them. That's not treating them right. And it's true. I would agree. So I think that's what veganism is. It's almost, you know, a rejection of the exploitation of animals in any way, shape or form. But probably if we were better stewards of animal husbandry and we didn't have such a greed for meat, sort of, for example, and if we didn't have such a system that allowed us to put chickens as you're saying, free-range eggs, you know, the system that allows us to put chickens into battery farms, then you know, having eggs is obviously fine, isn't it? From happy hens, there doesn't seem to be any problem with that. But I think the vegans just see this massive exploitation of animals on such an industrial scale that they want to reject it all, and I can understand I can understand that, but I don't think it's a moral thing as such. It's just, I can understand it, and I would personally eat much less meat.
What about I mean, I've owned 3 dogs, and what about keeping pets? I mean, it's unnatural for the dog, and you're using up scarce resources by feeding the thing, you know. I mean, but on the other hand, if you look upon what you know, what a pet can do for people, their own that dreadful word, mindfulness, you know, I think you'd lose the argument there.
I don't think there's an argument, though. Can I just say that I think that making it moral, these things don't really fit into a moral black and white framework, do they? And I've come to the conclusion that the basis of the bottom line is not correctness, or, you know, a new sort of Pharisaism is about whether you're, you know, whether you've got dogs or not, or whether you eat meat or not, but actually a love the bottom line is love. So the bottom line is not correctness, the bottom line is love. And although that might sound fuzzy, it means, you know, if when you consider this, you know, and it's so confusing sometimes, and it's exhausting thinking what's the right thing to do here, you have to act out of love for God and for the creation, and for one another, love for God, and so that's the bottom line. It's and that has to be how we approach it, and as Christians, I'm sure that's what we're asked to do, to love God with all our heart, soul and mind. With it, so when we get into these moral arguments, I think we're onto a bit of a loser, because we just get ourselves in a twist. a judgmental twist.
I like your expression, the new Phariseeism.
Yes. So love, it always, everything that is about love.
I mean, 1 Corinthians says that, doesn't it? 1 Corinthians 13 talks about love, and it's a well-known chapter. And love is so important. Love one another, and a body working together as one. Love is so important.
Which is a nice link into my next section, actually. So we'll move on, which is that my third point is that caring for creation is about loving our neighbour. And Dave made the point last week that climate change, the big picture, has a disproportionate effect on those who are the poorest in the whole of human society. Those living in areas that are most at risk of being submerged by rising sea levels are often in the least developed countries. So Bangladesh will be a prime example of a country where millions of people could be displaced when sea levels rise. You'll remember that Jesus has a discussion with a lawyer who asks him, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus responds, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And the man then asks a supplementary question, who is my neighbor? And I believe that's a question that we can ask ourselves. Who is our neighbor when we're thinking about caring for creation? Who is affected by our use of petrol and diesel in traveling long distances by car or by plane? Well, the impact is often on human beings in places distant from us, but those people are still our neighbors.
Yes.
Because all of humankind is made in God's image. And what happens in one place has a ripple effect elsewhere. And we're not always aware of what may happen. So I'm guessing that not many people would have realized that the Ukraine is one of the biggest wheat producers in the world. You may have known that, but I didn't. So what will happen as a result of the invasion there, the price of bread will be affected here and in other places too. Jesus chooses to answer the lawyer's question by telling a story about the most unlikely neighbor, the Samaritan, whom any self-respecting Jew wouldn't have been seen dead with, literally. And what Jesus is saying is that our neighbors are not restricted to those we share ethnic, cultural, or geographic links with. All our fellow humans are our neighbors, irrespective of how far away they live or what background they come from. And being just about to become a grandparent reminds me that our neighbors are also the unborn human beings yet to inhabit the earth, but they will be affected by our actions now and flourish or suffer accordingly. Now, I've got a quote here, and I'd like just for you to have a think about who said this, okay? And you might be surprised by the answer, okay? And the quote is this: no generation has a freehold on this earth. All we have is a life tenancy with a full repairing lease. We are its guardians and trustees for generations to come. So who said that?
How about Bill Gates?
No, closer to home, so UK.
Prince Charles?
No.
Attenborough?
No.
Was it a church person?
Not a church person, Rachel, no. Well, they did go to church, I think.
Bono.
Margaret Thatcher.
Oh.
Oh.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I thought that would surprise people.
Yeah.
The Old Testament is very clear in its emphasis on exercising responsibility for the good of future generations, so that God's name and his blessings go through all the generations. And climate change and activities now that produce greenhouse gases have consequences for people across the planet. Warmer average temperatures may mean people having to leave their homeland on the edge of the Sahara because the land can no longer sustain crops. And that's happening now. And those farmers are forced to migrate and make the dangerous crossing to Europe because they actually have no other option. Who is my neighbour? The young man in the boat crossing the English Channel. As Christians, we are called continually to reflect on how our actions affect other people, and where necessary, we're called to give up some of our rights for the sake of others. Paul says to the church in Philippi, each of you should not only look to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. The reason to do that is because our attitude should be the same as Jesus, who made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant. For me, one of the most compelling arguments from the Bible in favor of Christians making creation care a priority is that we're called as disciples to love our neighbor as ourselves. Yeah. So we should have as much care for others as we have for ourselves. And Jesus also calls us to care for the poorest and most marginalized in our world. That's a gospel imperative. So if we choose to ignore our responsibilities in looking at our individual impact on creation, then we're ignoring Jesus' commands to love our neighbors as ourselves. My final point is that caring for creation is about demonstrating our hope for the future. My daily readings at the moment are from the book of Revelation. I know that will be Jan and Patrick's as well.
Yeah.
And the question I asked this morning in the service is, are we in the last days? Which is something that people have been speculating over the last 2 years. And now we have the conflict in Ukraine. Does this presage the end of the world and the second coming of Christ, when all things will be reconciled to God? If you read Roger's piece in the notice sheet, he reflects on this point, that the creation has been subject to frustration, but there is hope that creation will be liberated from bondage. But at present, the whole of creation is groaning. And why is creation frustrated and groaning? Partly because human beings have not carried out God's mandate to care for it as servant kings. So creation has been prevented from reaching its full God-given potential. It cannot reflect God's glory fully in the way that he intended. Now, Paul doesn't say that we will escape a world about to be burnt up. He says our bodies will be redeemed and the glory of God will be revealed. And when this new creation is revealed, the earth will no longer be subject to decay. The groans of childbirth are the herald of a new life, a new beginning. And creation is groaning in its birth pangs as it awaits renewed life. And as Roger points out, the Garden of Eden and the New Jerusalem have strikingly similar features. The work that we do now in caring and restoring creation will not be wasted. When Jesus comes again, our hope as Christian believers is that we will experience bodily resurrection. Our bodies will be transformed into spiritual bodies that don't age or die. And our role will be to work alongside Jesus to fully restore the created order, to reflect the glory of God. So what we do now in working to restore creation is a foretaste of what we will be doing in the future when Jesus comes again. Jesus calls us to announce that the kingdom of God is here, but only in part. It will be brought about completely by the decisive intervention of Christ's return. But we're not simply to wait expectantly, but to work actively in God's world now, to declare through our words and actions that God cares about creation. He will redeem it. We can't bring this redemption of creation about through our own efforts. That is wrecked time after time by human sinfulness and selfishness. Look at the efforts of the countries to find, to go back on words that were promised at COP26. But there is continuity between our world today and the world to come when Jesus returns. And Paul talks about this in Corinthians. What we will build on this earth will be purified and transformed. And if what we built has good foundations, it will last into eternity. For me, it's interesting that the new heaven and earth are a city, but it's a garden city. But a city is a human construct, a place of community, which implies that some of the things that humans have done will be carried into the fulfillment of the new creation. To conclude, for me, we are called to foster and use the innate underlying goodness and fruitfulness of this material world to do what is pleasing to God now as creator. And I'm going to close with a final quote. And this is from a well-known Protestant theologian who said, "If I knew Jesus would return tomorrow, I would plant a tree today." And that's Martin Luther, not Margaret Thatcher.
You said that.
That's nice.
That's historic. Martin Luther.
Andy, that's been very helpful this afternoon, especially those scriptures. It's been very helpful because I've been looking at the message. That's where I took that Psalm 8 from.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, you mentioned right at the end though, First Corinthians. What verse was that?
Sorry, I should have given you the chapter and verse. And that. Give me a minute, Darren. I'll just find it.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Any other questions? Oh, here we go. It's 1 Corinthians 3.
Okay.
Verse 12 through to 15.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
So any reflections from those of us who are here today?
I like that expression. The New Jerusalem is a garden city.
Yeah.
Not Letchworth or Welwyn Garden City, but the real one. That's brilliant.
Letchworth's a very nice place to live. I've got a friend who lives in Letchworth, and it's lovely. Sorry.
I worked for a grandson of Ebenezer Howard, who was the founder of the Garden City movement. So, yeah, I mean, it's great.
Mm.
One of the things that when I was looking at the Garden of Eden and New Jerusalem are the rivers that go out and water the earth.
Mm.
That to me had such a strong imagery that actually out of what God is calling us into, it will water and replenish the whole earth in a way that I don't think we can understand. I find that to be such an exciting vision and image. Why wouldn't you want to commit to that? I mean,
yeah, brilliant. Yeah, Sheila, you were sorry.
I've just got a question.
Yeah,
and which I think Roger knows about because I've been in conversation with him about it, and I'm trying to understand, and still not got there yet. But I don't quite understand how you reconcile some of this with what it says in 2 Peter chapter 3, when it talks about the heavens will pass away, the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. It says everything will be dissolved. I can't quite understand how you can reconcile the two.
I can. That's why I wrote a paper on it.
I know, but I still can't get it.
I don't have a problem with that. I think
I'm trying.
If you read 2 Peter in the context of what he's actually talking about, he's talking about the destructive and corrupting works of people, either in the church or in the world. And the term for what's coming should be seen as refining, much as you would subject something to heat to burn off the impurities. And I think when I hear fire there, balance it out with all the other scriptures which would not support the reading as you've just boldly put it, straight on its own. If you take it in its own, then you could take that construction, but taken with the rest, it is more the refiner's fire. It's a refining that what was going to come out the other side will be purged of all the effects of sin, mankind's rebellion, mankind's mismanagement. and all of that will be gone, leaving a purified and renewed earth. Because going back to what Paul said, he didn't say the whole of creation is groaning for its own destruction. He said it's waiting for its redemption. And a destructive fire does not relate to redemption. It relates to destruction, not purification. So I think if you take the whole of Scripture, Old and New Testament, it's got to be refiner's fire and not destructive, total destructive fire. But in my reading of 2 Peter, it almost stands on its own as one passage. And there are so many others to balance that out in the other direction. So it must pull your understanding of that towards redemption. And Andy's mentioned it quite strongly.
I think the other thing is that fire can actually be a, as well as being a purging thing, that actually it's a necessary thing within creation. So although the forest fires in Australia and in the Western US are destructive, there's also a need sometimes for, it's a way of creation renewing itself, because the old stuff is burnt away and then new growth comes through. And I think that's right, isn't it, Rachel?
Yeah. I mean, there's examples of that, aren't there? That and the poem, that the fire lily that requires there are other things, aren't there? Other plants that require some burning before they will flower, or before they'll germinate, and so and volcanic. I mean, you know, there are power. There is energy in the earth that is, you know, volcanic and fire. And I mean, a volcano is very, very, you might say destructive, but it's also very creative. So.
And volcanic areas are very fertile, actually. You know, in terms of things, plants and vegetation growing near a volcano, it's the soil there is amazingly fertile, but it's also potentially very destructive. I don't know if that helps, Sheila.
I sense it doesn't, but no.
It's all right.
Being dissolved with heat sounds a bit final to me, but I'll keep working on it. Might need to have a look at the original language and see, you know, some of what's the real, you know, meaning of some of the words. But I mean,
also you've got to think that sometimes images are used for dramatic effect and for contrast, like Jesus said, heaven and earth might pass away. That's what it literally means, but my word will never pass away. He wasn't saying we're going to rubbish everything. He's just saying, actually, compared with even the permanence of the earth, my word is even more permanent, eternal significance. So there are lots of other uses of language at play here: imagery, metaphor, simile, analogies, all sorts of things at work. And it is that the danger is we put too much weight on one image and make it literal, when actually it's not meant to be that way. It's there for an effect in what's written at its time, in its setting. You have to bring in other scriptures to balance it out, to get a rounded view of what's being said. I don't think one scripture is at odds with another. It's just we have sometimes difficulty. If we take a totally literalistic view of every word in the Bible, then we're lost before we start. So we have to be careful about genre, about imagery, about poetry, about metaphor, and all those sort of things, and also the intentions of the writer, what they're trying to say. So but for me, it's a matter of the whole revelation of God in the Bible, from cover to cover. That's why the other day I started with Eden and finished with the New Jerusalem, because everything in it counts, but it's got to be everything. We can't be selective in what we decide we're going to take or not.
I do think that when Jesus, though, talks about his second coming in Matthew, that it is going to be there are going to be some major cataclysmic events, if you like, you know, that the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. The sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. So there is going to be, it's going to be very evident that this is the second coming, and that will result. But he doesn't say in there, but all the tribes of the earth will mourn and they will see the Son of Man coming. So there's not a sense that they're going to be burnt up, but there will be people who, you know, 2 men will be in the field, 1 will be taken, 1 left. So there is going to be an element of judgment, like, in when Jesus comes again. And so maybe that's what Peter's saying about the fire, but there'll be that winnowing of, you know, and the fire is a purifying thing, as Roger said.
I remember, I mean, not that I remember, but I'm reminded of when the flood happened, you know, that was pretty devastating for the earth, wasn't it? When God sent the flood, and that was majorly cataclysmic, but he had to do it.
But it wasn't for Noah's family and a sample of all the live animals and insects that were alive and birds at the time. So yeah, redemption.
He rescued them,
total destruction. But I think the other issue is to do with the nature of apocalypsis, or the writing about the end times or uncovering what is secret. There is by essence a certain drama built into the way in which that is presented, because it's talking about the future and all that kind of thing, and it does use dramatic imagery throughout any form. Talk of Daniel, well, Jesus, when he talked about the destruction of Jerusalem and what would follow, and parts of Revelation, of course. The apocalypse, what Ezekiel is another, that they're all very, very visually impactful and very, very dramatic by essence, because of what they're talking about, and to get a message across to people, to wake people up to the danger that they're in. By essence, it's like sounding a siren, if you will. When you hear the siren, run for cover. In other words, you could do something about it. You've got to respond to it. And I think that there's another issue that's at work here with 2 Peter as well. So,
thank you.
That's a theological view, I know, but I mean, it is important to balance those things out.
Any other thoughts? Any other reflections that people have got on what we've looked at today?
Andy, what helped you to come to a decision to buy an electric car? I'm serious. I mean, it's not a joke. That isn't a joke.
Sorry.
Well, I just like to say I haven't bought it. I'm leasing it. Okay, well, in case I'm getting too much.
Yeah, you've got to. In one sense, you're buying.
I think Dave said last week he couldn't afford one.
Well, that's true.
So, I guess the reflections are about the fact of use of fossil fuels, petrol, diesel. I mean, we don't do lots of miles, to be fair. And I think the other point is that, which I'm being a bit of an early adopter, because this one actually comes with this. We're on this pilot where if everybody has an electric car, then the grid will crash, because you'll all be wanting to charge it up at the same time. The grid won't have enough electricity. So the idea is with this one that the energy company, who happen to be Octopus, but other energy companies do exist, are piloting a scheme whereby there's a charge back into the grid from the car. So if the car is sitting on the drive and not going to be used, but the grid needs electricity, then you plug it in and then it charges back into the grid at the peak time, and then recharges the car back overnight on the off-peak time. Unfortunately, Octopus haven't got the app working, so it's not actually been very useful being part of that pilot for me. But I think those are the main reasons that we wanted to try and do something. In fact, probably and I think when we come on to that in future weeks, one of the things that we are doing is that we're encouraging. So actually, all the leadership team are doing a personal lifestyle audit on their own carbon footprint, and what we're not going to ask people to disclose what their results are.
We're not going to publish it then. Oh dear.
but we are
only hackers.
Yeah, name and shame. It's the most. But we are going to then say, well, look, we've all done this, and we believe this would be a profitable thing for members of the congregation to do, to look at what they do in terms of their own impact on use of fossil fuels, etc. So that's part of what we'll be doing as part of the Eco Church. The whole thing about having Eco Church certification is not just about getting a logo that we can put on our website saying we are a bronze or a silver or a gold. Actually, this is about changing the heart. It's about people reflecting on their own individual situations, and also us looking as a church at how we can be more effective in our use of stewardship of resources. And one of the things that I would say is that, I mean, it doesn't affect me because obviously, well, at the moment I can't get my charger to work at home. That's another story. But I am actively going to suggest that we think about having a charger at church. Partly because actually there are very few. So my charger at home isn't. It doesn't work at the moment. The only public charger in Seaford at the moment is at Morrison's. There's no other public chargers here. So we have a car park that's open to people. It's not a closed car park, and I think it would be a good thing for us to offer that as a community resource. And obviously, we'd have to work it all out in terms of how it's charged and how that works, what we have to pay, what, etc. But I think that will, for me, it would make a good statement. I think the town council are looking at electric charging points, but that is the big problem with having an electric car at the moment is there are the network of charging points is not very widespread, and it's also very complicated to use. So you have to have different apps for each of the different charging networks.
In the last 5 or 6 years, the three local supermarkets have completely refurbished their petrol stations. None of them put in an electric point.
No.
The other issue is there's a thriving market in stolen charging leads as well.
Yeah. So I just said that to Hannah. I wouldn't go up to London and stick it on charge in the street because there's no way to lock the charging lead on the car, so somebody can just lift it off and off they go with it. So yeah.
Sorry.
Go on. Janet's got something.
If you go down that road, and I do think it's a good thing to offer the community the chance to do that, but aren't you also responsibly thinking about renewables and putting some panels on the roof or something really to counterbalance the fact that you're buying electricity to sell to somebody else?
Yeah, solar panels.
Yeah, I mean, Roger was talking about that the other day. Actually, that Roger, you explain about the film, because you can explain that better than I can.
When the roof was designed for the hall, it was designed with a view to fitting flexible PV panels on it, and because its orientation, we could cover the whole thing, and it's designed so they could be clipped on, and we could do that. We didn't do it at the time because we didn't have the money, although it was thought about. So yes, we could invest in solar thermal, in PV, photovoltaics. And it would just be because that's the right thing to do, because there's no payback in it at all, really, not over its lifetime. The one that does have any kind of realistic payback is what Patrick and Janet got, which is solar thermal, evacuated tube or other, in order to get all your hot water.
We've got that, yeah.
Which is what you've got. That is very efficient, and you can get payback of 7 years from that. I used to put it on the houses I designed because it was so efficient. So there are other things we could do. The only difference for us is we don't use an awful lot of hot water in the church, because it's not a hotel and it's not a residence. So there is no economy of scale to make that.
We might get the caps washed clean when they're not put through the dishwasher.
Exactly. It wouldn't give us that kind of return, because you have to think about return, because you're making an investment. But certainly we could, with the development of new thin, flexible photovoltaic films, there's much more of a chance. In fact, what's in development now are sprayed on coatings that are solar PV, photovoltaic. So technically speaking, any surface on a building could be rendered into a way of producing electricity. And it's not high efficiencies at the moment, but they're getting better. So there is a lot of research into that. So
what about heat pumps?
Retrofit to an existing building. Far better, of course, is to insulate buildings, even old buildings. Stop losing the heat in the first place and not needing the electricity or gas to heat them. But that's a different matter, I think.
I was really basing my thoughts not on the payback so much as the balance between putting in an electric charge. If we need more electricity to run our cars, shouldn't we therefore also be thinking of how can we contribute to the supply that's available?
Yeah,
that's all.
That's a good point.
Yeah, no, good point.
It does feed into the grid, essentially, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does reduces your reliance, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. I think somebody at the moment is having those solar panels fitted in the congregation, and they said that they're actually getting them fitted with battery storage.
Yeah.
Because that's the more efficient way of doing it, because the electricity is then stored inside, and then is used obviously when required. So these are all things that we'll need to look at, I believe.
If we are to be a more successful church in the spiritual realm, we're going to have a lot more baptisms, and that must be our biggest drain on energy. You're running two electric kettles for 18 hours every time you have a baptism.
Right, I think we'll just have to revert to having cold water, Peter.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay, fine. You're going in it. I'm not.
Yeah, it's wetsuits.
Yeah. No, that's. I've got one other thought, which is like a theological one. It just came to me. I thought, well, I think the view that, you know, that we'll be whisked away somewhere spiritual and the earth dissolved, and is somehow more a spiritual worldview than an incarnational worldview. And I was understanding that better in the last year or two, that what Jesus brings us is incarnation, and as Christians, an incarnational worldview in which we take care of you know, God's in a way, God's incarnation in creation, as in God, you know, created the earth, created humans, as opposed to a very spiritualized worldview, which is the one which says that this, in a way, the earthly and the things that are physical are seen as somehow less important, and that actually in the end we'll just sort of escape off into a spiritual realm, which isn't really that isn't the whole picture, as you're saying,
No,
Roger.
it's not.
The whole story of the Bible is incarnational. So that idea of being whisked away and that everything being dissolved that's physical just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit with the whole of the story of the Bible.
No, it doesn't. And in fact, going back to the last 2 chapters of Revelation, that is basically the boundary between the spiritual and the physical. Heaven and earth no longer exists, because heaven comes down and God dwells amongst his people.
Which, of course, God has already done in Jesus.
He has done that in one sense, but this is in the final sense.
Entirety, yeah.
It's utterly done. So I think you're absolutely right. And there's a strong physicality in the new heaven and new earth. It is physical. But with the spirit, the boundaries that we now have, that what we create boundaries between the physical and the spiritual no longer would apply, because sin has been dealt with, and that boundary, that division is no longer there. But it's interesting imagery as well. It's rich. It's lots to talk about, lots to explore. I think it's exciting. But we don't have to wait, do we? Because actually we're already we've already entered into eternity, those of us who are disciples of Jesus. So for us, it's already started.
Amen.
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't want to, we were talking in a very practical way, so I didn't want to distract us from that. It was
no, that's fine. That's fine, Rachel.
Incarnation is so fundamental in...
But I think it's motivational, actually, not distractional. So I agree with you. Brilliant.
I think there's a sense in which there will be a shaking and a time of purging and renewal, but I do believe that when Jesus comes again, he will restore creation, but that restoration process is one that we'll be working alongside him.
Yes.
Yeah.
To do, because we're not going to be sitting there on our clouds with our harps, strumming away. We'll be working alongside Jesus, restoring creation. So in some senses, if we're doing that now, we're in the business of restoring and redeeming now, that all we're doing is replicating what will happen when Jesus returns.
I mean, there's a sense in which that destruction happens, doesn't it, as we were saying, naturally, and then a new beginning happens, and that new beginning often is a kingdomly beginning, and we see that in I don't know, I was just thinking about the Berlin Wall, and I know it goes round and it comes, and different destructions happen in our world, and then sometimes oh no, my daughter, I'm sorry, in the middle of anyway, I just wanted to say but that's I think I made a point.
Okay.
We
have plenty of practice runs.
Yes.
Destruction and rebirth, things that does happen.
Roger, you mentioned 1 Peter 1.
1 Peter
1, wasn't it?
1 Peter 3, I think it was.
2 Peter 3, yeah.
2 Peter 3, sorry.
2 Peter 3.
I can send you what I produced for discussion anyway on there, if you want to look at it, and you can have a look at it for yourself. So I'll let you have that.
Thank you.
All right.
Good. So I think the plan is to have this has been recorded, so we will find a way to get this onto YouTube, I think. So because Ray and Kathy Finch couldn't join us today from Norfolk, so they were asking about where it would be available. So we'll work that out, and then I don't know if we'll be able to work that out in order for Peter to let people know tomorrow, Roger. I don't know whether that...
I've recorded it. I'll have the file. We'll have to get some way of transferring it, because it's quite a large file, isn't it? It's an MP4.
Yeah.
We might have to do that via the cloud, the share thing. I'll have to work that one out. So
you might be able to do it by
WeTransfer.
Transfer app.
Sorry?
Yeah, WeTransfer is probably the best thing.
Okay, I'll try that. I've not tried it. Do you have to register for that?
I think you do, but it's not difficult.
Okay.
No cost.
So Peter, I think if you...
Okay, I'll try that.
If you were able to just say in the email tomorrow, maybe this will be available on YouTube at some stage this week.
Okay.
For people to watch, that would be great. Yeah.
That was a really good session, Andy. Thank you so much.
My other question, Andy, is for those people
that's really helpful, so I can go over it. It's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Darren. Yeah.
I have a question for those people that can't be online. Would it be on a CD? Could you make it into a CD, or is that impossible?
DVD.
DVD might be a bit tricky. I think. I don't know the technicality of that.
I'm just thinking of Emma, and I'm just thinking of Emma because she doesn't have a.
Oh yeah. So Emily, yeah.
Yeah.
CD might work.
You should get an audio as well as a video recording, Roger. When
you will get
when
an audio.
when it's it's downloaded, you should get both.
Okay.
So
I'm thinking of Emily, really.
I'll try and put those on WeTransfer, and then take it from there. Okay.
So I was going to pray for us now. We are going to meet next week. What we have next week is a piece definitely from Laura Lee Lovering, who's sent us a really helpful dialogue, really, about creation care from her perspective in Peru. Well, I think we've also asked Sarah Chin if she would be able to contribute something. So we're hoping that Sarah's will come in for next week as well, and then there'll be an opportunity for more questions and answers as well on the session. So that's the plan for next week. So spread the word amongst your groups to join us, and that will be great.